Hey, this is Craig Allaman with Cornelius Seed. We're gonna be out here in a soybean field, look at a few things, but mainly we're wanting to stage this crop. It's the time of the year. We should be in R3, R4 in some places maybe. Not quite there, still in R2 in other locations. We're down here in west central Illinois. This crop was planted in April, probably the 29th, 30th, somewhere in there. These early planted soybeans down here hit V3 by June the 1st, so they would have hit the early flowering window. So pretty far along compared to a lot of beans across the corn belt this year. But just wanted to kind of touch base on how we would stage this crop as far as fungicide timing is related. Most fungicide recommendations are going to hit that, get on there at that R3 stage. That's just in testing over time. That's the highest yielding application time frame for fungicides. So we'll just come out here and we'll get a plant pulled nice and easy. Maybe get some root to look at some roots. Knock that dirt off there. Looks like we've got good nodulation. It's just always good to look at the general health of the plant. That taproot's going down nice and straight. We like to see that. So as we talk about the staging here of this plant, a flower at any node, a flower that's open, is going to be the R1 stage. And then R2, we got to come up here to the top, and a node below a leaf, a trifoliate leaf that's fully extended. So I would call that fully extended because the leaves aren't touching each other. If you had a new leaf, I mean, this is pretty small here, but these leaves are still touching. They haven't unfolded. So we wouldn't consider that a fully, not a fully developed leaf, but a leaf that is fully unfurled. So we're looking at that one there. So when you go to the node below that, if you're looking for R2, you have a flower that's open there. Now we're past R2 here, but I'm just kind of taking you back to see what R2 would be. So a flower open on any part of the plant at any node, and usually it's going to be one of the lower nodes, is R1. When we get that node below the leaves that are completely unfurrowed with a flower, that's R2. So clearly we're at least in R2. And then when we start talking about R3, which again is the stage that we want to put a fungicide application on, if that's what we're doing, we would want to 4 nodes down from a fully developed leaf. And a fully developed leaf, usually we consider that it looks like the rest of the leaves on the plant. So this is not fully developed, this one here, because it's still pretty small yet. But this one looks pretty similar to the other leaves right next to it. So we're going to call that our first one. Count down second, third, and fourth. So R3 is going to be a 3/16 inch long pod at that node. Now this one right here, you can tell that this is a pod. I think we get a little bit, sometimes we get a little bit pushy when we just kind of have some fuzz there that I really wouldn't consider a pod yet, but that you can tell is definitely going to be a pod. And it doesn't take hardly anything to be 3/16 of an inch long. You're looking on a tape measure, that's your smallest lines, and you just need 3 of them. So that's probably a 1/4 of an inch there. Now the same thing go from R3 to R4, we count down the same amount of nodes. So we're here at the same node, and if we have a 3/4 of an inch long pod at that node, then we're at R4. So here I would say we're in R4. I'd say that's going to be 3/4 of an inch long. If we're not, we're awful close. So if we were putting a fungicide application on, we would maybe have wanted to already be out here, but we'll discuss that here in a little bit. I'll talk a little bit more, just kind of my opinion on the bean fungicides and maybe compared to corn. But so while we're here, we'll kind of look at some other things. We're starting to pod up pretty good on these plants. It's really good high yielding soybeans in this modern time frame. We like to have these branches down here that are producing pods, and you can see here we've got a bunch of pods here on this first branch, and here we've got a second branch that's producing some pretty darn good pods. Here's a third. In this case, a lot of times you just see a couple, but and then the rest of the way up we're just potted at the nodes on the main stem. So, you know, these soybeans look to have a pretty darn good yield potential. These are 30-inch rows planted at 140,000 is the population. So, I mean, that's a pretty good big stem and pretty good bushy, well-branched plant in the 30-inch rows. So I think we got good potential. As we look here just a little bit, you see some feeding on some of these leaves, you know, particularly right there. Japanese beetles. We've got Japanese beetles present in this field. So, you know, we would look at that when we're out here at this time frame. We're thinking about putting a fungicide on anyway, so that would be an opportune time to put an insecticide on if we thought we needed it. Now, you can see the feeding there, and that might look like quite a little bit of feeding, but you really need to get on a website and get some of these comparisons where they show you what percentage that is. They'll have pictures of soybean leaves, and it'll show you what 50% defoliation would look like, or 20%, or whatever. That amount of defoliation is actually very minor. That's probably in the single digits. I would be surprised if that's over 10%, because you've got to look at the whole plant. And you know, that's pretty massive on that one leaf right here, but you know, this is not really a great amount of damage, and we got leaves here that aren't damaged at all. So with Japanese beetles, I've always found, you know, first year or two that they came out, I sprayed a field. They weren't just along there's a stink bug down there, if you can see it, a green stink bug. Anyway, they were spread across the field. They weren't just on the edges, and that's another thing you look with Jap beetles, because a lot of times they'll be on the edges. But they were spread across the field. I sprayed, and about a week later they were back in there again. So not real confident in spraying Japanese beetles as far as being much of a value out here, because they've got to be pretty bad, and the defoliation's got to be pretty bad to want to do that when they can move back in so quickly. Well, we'll switch over and get on the tripod here and talk a little bit more about fungicides in general. Okay, we'll talk a little bit, just some general thoughts, and these are my thoughts through my years of experience and what my beliefs are on fungicide application on soybeans. And, you know, we'll kind of relate that back to corn too, because they're similar, but, you know, there's some differences there for sure. So first thing on corn, you know, nowadays on corn, we've got some pretty good new fungicides like Veltima. That one in particular I've used on my own crop this year. And I'm not pushing one over the other. There's a couple other new ones that, the newer class of chemistry that has a lot longer residual. And for corn, I'm very bought into that, because especially last year, or the last several years, when we get some diseases that are moving in later, like a tar spot, you know, southern rust is another one that comes to mind. A lot of times we'll move in later. And that longer residual, because if we're putting that on, you know, let's say that second week in July, it's a pretty big time frame when we're hitting tasseling in a lot of areas. That's good to have that longer residual that's going to get us, you know, through at least through that mid-August with some pretty good protection. On soybeans, you know, as we mentioned, we're going to spray at that R3 time frame, and that's generally the last week in July, first week in August. Can change, you know, depending on the year, of course, with temps and everything. But we don't need as long of a residual on soybeans. And, you know, the question is, what is it we're going after? Okay, because year in and year out on soybeans, we're going to have Septoria brown spot. That's kind of our main disease. We're going to have it every year. It's usually on the lower canopy. It's usually not real yield limiting. So then after that, you know, the soybean diseases are a lot less prevalent than corn diseases in the Corn Belt. We got a lot watch out for like frog eye leaf spot, and that's been moving further north. We've got it into, you know, the northern parts of Iowa now, and that's one that could be very yield limiting. This field here has a history of frog eye leaf spot, so, you know, we always watch for that in this situation. You know, other soybean diseases are not real prevalent up in the northern part of the Corn Belt, and you know, so a lot of times we can take care of that with just scouting. So why are we getting yield increases on soybeans? Because we are. I mean, spraying a fungicide, a lot of you have had very good luck with that, and we're getting yield increases. And I would argue it's similar to corn. We need to have the strobilurin portion of the fungicide in that package, that family of chemistry, and it's in almost any. I don't know if there's a fungicide today that doesn't have it in there. So most packages will have a strobe in there, and the strobies are a stress reliever. Okay, so it's the same thing with corn. We're putting on our fungicide application at R1, so silking. We do it at silking. It prevents kernels from being aborted, and it's going to really help us that first couple of weeks after we get pollination on kernel depth. And I think that's where a lot of our yield is coming from. The same thing in soybeans. We're doing it at the R3 stage, so we're fully flowered. We'll continue to flower at the top with new growth, but we're fully flowered and we're sticking on pods. Okay, that's the time of the year. And also I think key is end of July, 1st of August. You guys know this from whatever you do this time of the year, whether it's baling hay or fairs. You know, a lot of fairs are torturous hot. That's a real stressful time of the year. So we're heavy into the reproductive stage, and we usually have some pretty good stress. So if we can reduce that stress, particularly with that strobe at this time of the year, and prevent these plants from aborting flowers and aborting pods, because you go out here in stressful periods and pull back the canopy, it's not uncommon to see pods laying on the ground that have been aborted by these plants. So that's why we're looking at this kind of a time frame to get that fungicide application on. I question whether we need the more expensive, new, longer residual products for the soybeans. Okay, love them on the corn, question that we need them on the soybeans. I think you could get by with, you know, a generic, you know, co-op branded, whatever it is, a little less expensive version, as long as you got that strobe in there at this R3 time frame on the soybeans. You only need to hold them for another month, and you really just need that stress relief during this period of time when they have a lot of stress on them. And with that in mind, so we're R4 down here, we determined, but there's a lot of areas that are just hitting R3 as we get further north, the later planted soybeans, or maybe still in the R2 stage. And remember, to be in a stage, 50% of the field has to be in that stage. So you can't just come out here and pull the tallest plant and say, yep, I'm in R3. You need to take several samples and decide if your 50% of that field is in that stage. So I think what we want to look at also, because if we're talking about stress, we're talking about, you know, making sure that our timing is right on that stress. So right now, we've been having real cool nights, decent temps during the day, still high humidities, but we're in a time frame where these soybeans aren't real stressed unless we were in a droughty area. We've been having rains, pastures are still growing, still mowing the yard, so we're okay that way. But I'm looking at the calendar as I get close to this R3 time frame and seeing, do we have a week of dry weather? I think we've got 10 days of dry weather now predicted. When the temps start rising, we're going to get real stress conditions. So I want to get on the front end of that and relieve that stress at this time of the year, and I think that you're going to get the most bang for your buck out here. We saw some insects earlier. You have to have a real large amount of feeding, and you see leaves, you know, maybe half the leaf is gone, but that might just be 2 or 3 leaves on the plant. So you've got to have, you know, at least 20% defoliation during the later reproductive stage to want to put an insecticide on. Definitely an option if you're going out with a fungicide and you just want to toss a cheap insecticide in there. That's definitely your call on that. But the defoliation I'm seeing out here from these Japanese beetles is not real great. So I don't feel like I need to have an insecticide in there. And my experience with Japanese beetles, you spray them and come back a week later and they're back in there. So we don't have, there's not much residual on them, and they fly in from greater distances. So I haven't had very good luck trying to address them with an insecticide. So I think that's all we've covered right now. We've had a lot of questions on staging on soybeans and when do I put my fungicide application on, but you saw that plant that I pulled out and the amount of branching that it has. We have a really good crop looking at us here. Soybeans across the Midwest that I've been traveling in the last couple weeks, as ugly as they were 3 weeks ago, they look pretty fantastic right now. Not overly tall in a lot of areas, but height does not equal yield on soybeans. They're growing well, they're continuing to grow, they'll continue to grow while they're flowering and potting. because they're an indeterminate plant. So I think we have a pretty good potential if we can continue to get some rains here. And a fungicide application with the price of beans, if you're looking at good yields, you know, that return becomes a lot easier. So definitely something to think about. I hope this has helped, just as the staging and the timing and your thoughts on you know, what kind of a product that you want to use. So thanks for your time.